So welcome back to another episode of Real Estate Exam Prep, where I break down the real estate exam so that way you can pass on the first try. So today we're going to get into real property versus personal property. And that's very important as an agent. You have to be able to distinguish between real property and personal property, and you need it for the exam too. So remember, when your buyers are making an offer on a property, they're buying the real property, not the personal property. So we're going to break that down. We're going to get into, can personal property be converted into real property, and vice versa? Can real property be converted back into personal property? So let's get started. All right, so here we have property. Now, property is divided into two categories. We have real, and then we have personal property. Now, if we look at the real, we see that the real is further divided into corporeal and incorporeal real property. And we're going to break that down in just a second. And on the personal property, we have that it's broken into tangible and intangible. We're going to work with the real property first, and then we're going to jump into the personal property. As I mentioned before, real property is going to be divided into corporeal and incorporeal real property. Now, corporeal is going to be the land and anything physically attached to it. Fences, buildings, any kind of improvement, structures. That's going to be considered corporeal real property. Think of the stuff that you can see. If you're looking at a property, the stuff that you can see, that's considered corporeal real property. Now, incorporeal real property is going to be the stuff that you can't see, but it's going to be considered real property, okay? Things like easements, right-of-ways, licenses. That's all going to be considered incorporeal real property. Now, if you haven't watched or if you're not familiar with the easements, I do have a video on easements. I'll leave the link here. You can click on it, and we break down easements and right-of-ways. All right, so let's get into what real estate is and what real property is and what the differences are. So when it comes to real estate refers to the land and anything fixed, immovable, or permanently attached to it, such as appurtenances, and these are going to be our rights and benefits like the easements and things like that. Buildings, fences, fixtures, that's another term that we're going to dive deeper in just a moment. Improvements, roads, perennials, shrub and trees, not growing crops, and I'll explain why. Natural resources such as air, mineral, and water. If you're not familiar with the air, mineral, and water, then I recommend watching my video on the bundle of rights, and we break down what you own when you buy property. Now, improvement. So what's an improvement? Improvement just means that you made the land better, right? So if you take raw land with nothing on it, just dirt and grass, and you put a fence on it, a shed, whatever it is, it's an improvement. You made the land better. It increased in value. So that's what they're referring to there. Fixtures is going to be a term that we're going to dive into once we start getting into personal property. And then appurtenances. And again, these are going to be your easements, licenses, right-of-ways. It's going to be considered real property where, you may not be able to see it, but it's going to be attached to the deed. Okay, so that's real estate. That is what real estate consists of. Now, when we're speaking of real property, what we're speaking of here is the bundle of rights and the benefits and interests you have in that real estate. So that's what we're referring to when we speak of real property. So the real estate and the bundle of rights. Now, let's get into that term appurtenances, okay? So what are appurtenances? So appurtenances are rights, benefits, and improvements such as easements, right-of-ways, etc., attaching to the property to which it is connected and will pass with the title or runs with the land. Now, what run with the land means is that if the seller doesn't mention that there's an easement or a right-of-way on the property and they transfer the title to the buyer, just because they didn't mention it doesn't mean that it falls off. It stays with the title. So that's why appurtenances are considered incorporeal real property. It's real property. When you're buying a property, you're going to get it. You just can't see it, but that benefit's still going to remain. Okay, so you may see that runs with the land on the exam. That just means that if the seller doesn't mention whatever that easement is or whatever it is, the buyer's still going to have the rights of that because it's attached to the deed. So as I mentioned before, personal property is broken into two categories. We're going to have tangible and we're going to have intangible personal property. Now, tangible just means that you can pick it up, right? So if you have a pen, if you have a water bottle, whatever it is, you can pick it up. It's not attached to the real property. It's not attached to a house or to the land or anything like that, okay? Here the example that we have are chairs, tables, television, lawnmowers. These are things that people, some buyers, sometimes they fight over when they're making an offer on a house. They're like, oh, I want this stuff. But you have to understand You're buying the real property. You're not buying the personal property. So those items don't necessarily come with the property. You have to ask for them, and oftentimes you're buying those items on the side instead of having it included in your deal. So tangible personal property is going to be things that are not attached to real property, and it's tangible. You can touch. Okay. Now, intangible personal property are going to be things, again, that are not attached to real property. They're personal property, but you may not be able to touch them, right? So things like stocks, copyrights, cryptocurrency, royalties, those are all examples of intangible personal property. It's personal property. It's not attached to a home or to a property, but you can't see it, right? So it's intangible. Now, let's get into some other terms that we use to reference personal property. Now, this term right here, shadow, I promise you, you're going to see this on the exam. All right. They like to use this word because most people forget what it means. And it's just a fancy word for personal property, right? So it's property which is tangible, movable, and not fixed to the land or real estate. It's also referred to as personal property or personalty. Okay. So you might see it either way. Either way, shadow, personal property, or personalty means the same thing. Okay. Now, for a lot of folks, shadow, the way I remember it is that shadow sounds like cattle. And if you buy a cattle, like a cow, it roams on the earth, right? It's not attached to the earth, it roams. So because it roams and it's not attached to it, it's going to be personal property. That's how I remember it. If that helps you, then great. If not, we'll come up with a different way and remember it, okay? But you will see that on the exam. Now, if you recall, when we talked about real estate, it said that anything attached to the ground except for growing crops. And growing crops has a separate designation. Growing crops are actually considered personal property, okay? We refer to them as emblements. So emblements, also referred to as fructus industrialis, that's Latin, refers to fruit of labor or fruits of your labor, are going to be crops that you have to plant annually. It doesn't come back, these plants don't come to life every year. You have to plant them annually. So it's going to be things like vegetables such as corn, wheat, rye, oats, and other grains that you have to manually plant on an annual basis. So even though the plant itself is attached to the ground, the harvest, right, what that plant produces is going to be considered personal property. So that's important to understand that, because if you are in a farming area, right, or maybe if you're in Mass and you're in Western Mass and there's some farms out there, you have to understand that the harvest doesn't necessarily come with the purchase of the property. You're going to have to make special provisions and say, hey, we're buying this, but we're also expecting the harvest, right? So the harvest by default isn't automatically included in the deal. You'll have to make mention of that. All right, so now the question we have is, can personal property become real property, right? Can personal property become real property? Now I'm going to ask you this question. When a new subdivision is being built, right, does the earth just open up like in the cartoons and these houses just start popping up out of nowhere? No, I wish we wouldn't have the problem that we have right now, right, with lack of inventory. We have to build the houses, right? So can personal property become real property? The answer is yes. And that process, that term, when an item of personal property becomes real property, is called a fixture. Okay, so a fixture, are items of personal property that have become real property when it was attached to a building or land, right? So let's talk about the construction of a home. When you're building a home, right, the first thing you do is you dig for the foundation. When you make the hole in the ground, that hole is real property, right? It's just a hole in the ground. Now I have cement coming in a cement truck, right? We're going to fill that hole and we're going to make the foundation of the home. That cement, as it's churning around in the truck, that cement is personal property. It's not attached to the ground, at least not yet, right? It's nasty. You don't want to touch it, but that's going to be personal property. It's tangible personal property. Now we take the cement, we pour it in the hole, and now that cement cures and it hardens and it's embedded in the ground. Now we have a fixture. We have an item that was personal property. It got converted into real property because now it's attached, it's embedded in the ground, right? Now we're going to continue building the house. Now we have to frame the house. So, we get wood, the lumber, And if we sit the lumber on the ground, we don't attach it, but we sit the lumber on the ground, that lumber is going to be personal property, tangible personal property, because you can pick it up. It's not attached to anything. But if you get some nails and screws and you start hammering it to the foundation, and now you have the framing of a house, now guess what? That wood has now become real property. It's been attached to the real property, okay? So that's the process. So personal property can be converted into real property, and the term for that is a fixture. Now there's another fixture that we need to talk about, and that's called a trade fixture, okay? Now, when you see trade fixture, think of trade as what you do for your occupation, what you do for work, for your trade, okay? So this is going to be a fixture that you are utilizing for your business, for your trade, okay? So by definition, a trade fixture, they're installed by a tenant for business purposes and are considered personal property unless they are left behind after the lease has expired. So we'll take an example of like a hair salon, right? Hair salons, they have those nice little sinks, right? They wash your hair, everything's great. Well, when you go to Home Depot and you buy the sink and you're bringing it into the shop, that's personal property, tangible personal property. Now you connect it to the wall, you hook up the plumbing, it's attached to the property now. So in theory, it is real property. However, you're using that sink for your business. It's a trade fixture. You're using it, to wash people's hair. You have a salon. So because it's a trade fixture, that item is considered still personal property, meaning that when you leave, you can take that item with you. You can remove it from the structure. Now there's going to be, there's rules. You'll have to, make sure you repair whatever damage you made when you're removing that item, but you're able to take that item with you. If you leave it behind after the lease expires, it just becomes property of the owner. And if they, if you have a security deposit, they may charge you to have it removed or whatever it is. But as a business owner, you do have that right. You have that right of a trade fixture where you can install things for your business, and then you have the right to remove that when the lease is up for your business. So we talked about personal property being converted into real property, right? And that term was fixtures. Now, can real property be converted back into personal property? Can we go backwards? The answer is yes. And there's two ways that we can go backwards, okay? The term for that is either severance or actual severance. Same thing, doesn't matter. Think of severance as the item is severed from the structure, right? And then the other one is constructive severance. And constructive severance is going to be more of an intention, and we'll go deeper into that, okay? Now, to kind of help you understand this, for you folks out there that watch Fixer Upper, Fixer Upper with Chip and Joanne, right? So Joanne loves to put this item in people's homes all the time. I've never heard of it until I watched the show, and it's called shiplap, right? So you might have been like, oh, shiplap, yeah. What is shiplap? Well, oftentimes shiplap is recycled wood. It's wood that she took from other properties, and now she's going to make an accent wall or something like that. She's going to repurpose that wood, and it's going to be this nice, big, beautiful thing, okay? So yeah, you can take real property and convert it back into personal property. So severance or actual severance means that you actually severed it. You removed it. Like you took it off. It was a door. You want to keep this door. You took the door off the building. You severed it, okay? Constructive severance is going to be more of intention. So for instance, let's say you're buying a house and they have a hot tub, on the deck, okay? Now, when you're looking at the property, you see the hot tub. It's there, physically there, right? So in theory, it's a fixture, right? It's part of the property. But the owner says, hey, listen, at closing, that item is going to be removed, right? So through constructive severance, the intentions are that at closing, when you buy this house, that item is going to be physically removed. It's not going to be there. So that's where constructive severance kind of comes into play. Now, can everything be converted back into personal property? Well, there's three rules, right? There's three things that we look at to determine whether or not an item that is real property can be converted back into personal property. The first thing that we look at is the method of annexation, meaning how easily can you remove that item? If you remove that item, is it going to cause mass destruction or damage to the property or to the area, to the walls or whatever it is? then no, you can't remove it. So like if you're buying a property and it has a built-in, let's say China cabinet, and the owners are like, oh my God, I just love that cabinet. I want to take that with me. Well, guess what? You can't, because if you remove that, you're removing the wall. Like it's going to cause, too much damage. At that point, you will not be able to convert that item into personal property. The next one is adaptation of real estate. How is that item being utilized? So an example we have here is maybe a pellet stove, okay? Now, if the pellet stove is the main heating source of the house, you cannot remove that, because that's what makes the house habitable, right? Is that you need heat in order to, you need a heating source, you need a furnace. So you wouldn't be able to do that. Now, if this pellet stove was, let's say, in another room, but you have a furnace that can heat the house, but this pellet stove is just like an accent piece somewhere, well then yes, you then could remove that. Of course, you have to disclose it as the seller. But at that point, you would have the ability to convert that back into personal property and take it because of the adaptation of real estate. And then the last one is going to be agreement. Sometimes there might be something that, like the most common thing we run into a lot is chandeliers, right? Is that, you walk into a property, has this big, beautiful chandelier, and the seller says, you know what, that's a family heirloom, and we're planning on taking that item. We'll replace it with something else, right? Another light fixture that's comparable or whatever it is. So as long as you and the buyer, the seller and the buyers agree of an item being removed and replaced, then that's fine. Then that item can be converted back into personal property. Now, by default, appliances. We see this a lot. Now, on the exam 2, appliances, regardless of the type, whether they're gas or electric, will always be considered personal property, because the method of annexation is so simple. Because technically, you take a refrigerator, you plug it into an outlet, guess what? It's attached to real property. It's plugged into an outlet, right? The outlet is connected to the house and everything else. So it's real property. Now, to convert it back into personal property, just pull the plug. Now it's personal property. So because the method of annexation is so easy, appliances will always be considered personal property. So there you have it, folks. That is the difference between real property and personal property. Just remember, anything that's not attached to the land or the property is going to be considered personal property, and anything attached to the land or the property or the building is going to be considered real property, okay? Well, thanks for watching. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, leave them below. I will leave the link for my easements video, so if you want to brush up on that, and also the bundle of rights and what you get when you own property, the air rights, surface rights, and the subterranean rights. I'll leave the link below there, okay? Well, as always, folks, thank you, and until next time.